Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have you. My name is Daniel. I'm currently a student at Moody Bible Institute, and I'm going to be moderating a debate between a Moody student and the co-author of the book Evolving Out of Eden. To introduce the question of debate, the question is, does science affirm God? Now, my colleague Daniel Kim is going to be arguing that science does affirm God, while Edwin Swarmanen is going to be arguing that science does not affirm God. To get this debate going, Daniel is going to have 10 minutes to present his argument, and then Edwin is going to have another 10 minutes to present his argument. Then afterwards, there will be a 5-minute rebuttal. After each side is given a 5-minute rebuttal, there will be a conversation period where the audience will be able to raise their hands and ask a specific question to a specific debater. I'm going to ask Daniel Kim to present the first argument of the night, and the floor is yours whenever you are ready.
Okay, so good evening, friends. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to partake in this debate, and also at Eastern University. The topic of tonight's debate is an age-old question: does science confirm God or affirm God? In other words, does science go against the existence of God, or does science confirm it? And so in today's debate, it's very significant because for some of us here, life's meaning is in the line, and also our eternal destiny, and also the afterlife, and all these other kinds of things are in the line. So this is very significant for us here. And science has been advancing quite rapidly within the 21st century, and we're discovering things in this life, in this universe, like we've never done before. And instead of science hurting the faith of a theist, it actually begins to support it. And for example, Francis Crick has discovered the complex chemical language or code within the DNA, and which begs the question, where did this genetic information come from that dictates human life? Physics has been advancing, as well as astrophysics and modern cosmology, where it has been showing incredible design in the universe and how it has been finely tuned on a razor's edge. And also the Standard Model, or the Big Bang Theory, start to support the account of what we call the Book of Genesis, where it purports the creation ex nihilo, which is creation out of nothing. And that it has, and also that there is a singularity and a point of beginning. And so for tonight's debate, I'll be arguing two main contentions. Firstly, that there are good reasons to believe that science does confirm God. And secondly, there are no good reasons to believe that science doesn't confirm God. So I'll be presenting three arguments supported by scientific evidence that confirm the existence of God. So firstly, the Kalam cosmological argument confirms the existence of God. So the first premise begins like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. And the conclusion is that the universe has a cause. The first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, is from the principle of causality. This means that if something began to exist, something caused it to exist. And even David Hume agrees with this principle that it would be absurd for something to arise out of nothing that is uncaused. And also, it is a bit absurd to say that something can come from nothing without a cause. And it leaves us wondering why anything cannot pop out of nowhere without a cause, and that it originates from nothing. So, and we also look at the second premise, which is that the universe began to exist. And it is backed up by scientific discoveries from scientific evidences, which is the microwave background radiation, which is basically the afterglow of the Big Bang, and also the expansion of the universe, and also the second law of thermodynamics shows that the world began to exist. Now also the Standard Model, otherwise known as the Big Bang Theory, shows us that this world was created out of nothing. P.C.W. Davies comments this, saying, "On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event. That the creation not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but also of space-time itself." And we must really understand that it is quite absurd to say that nothing can create something. And according to an atheistic worldview, nothing has produced something. But however, we know that it is only something that can produce something, and that there was a cause to this universe to come about ex nihilo. And third premise logically follows from premise 1 and 2 that the universe has a cause. And the cause should be immaterial, timeless, and also spaceless, and an omnipotent being who has brought the world into existence, and that it is whom we will refer to as God. So I'm going to go forth with the second argument, which is the fine-tuning argument that affirms the existence of God. By fine-tuning, I mean the extraordinary balancing of the fundamental laws and parameters of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. And here's how the argument follows. First premise is the fine-tuning is due either to chance, necessity, or design. It is, in a second premise, it is not due to chance nor necessity. And third, therefore, the fine-tuning is due to design. It is highly unlikely that this fine-tuning we see in this universe is a result of physical necessity. William Lane Craig, he asserts this, saying, "This alternative seems extraordinarily implausible because it requires us to believe that a life-prohibiting universe is virtually, physically impossible. And also, it is very highly unlikely that this is due to chance. There are at least 30 of these physical parameters that require precise calibration in order to produce a life-sustaining universe." Then here's just 3 examples that I'd like to present. First is this: if the rate of the expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million times million, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. Here's another example. If we could even alter the gravity setting to even a tiny hair's length difference, life would not exist. And here's a third example. If the electromagnetic force were slightly stronger or weaker, then life would not exist. To have a cosmological constant, for example, to happen by chance, according to PhD Robin Collins, who's also a physicist, says that the chances of that happening is 1 part in the 100 times million times billion times billion times billion times billion times billion. So that's 10 followed by 53 zeros afterwards, that this can actually happen by chance, which is only 1 constant. So to make a quick illustration, that's like being in space and you're throwing a dart randomly towards Earth. And when you're throwing it randomly towards Earth, the dart would hit the bullseye that's actually 1/trillionth of an inch in diameter. So that's less than a size of 1 solitary atom, and that's the chances of that happening by chance. So if 1 constant to happen by chance is so unlikely, then how much more unlikely would it be to have all 30 constants happen by chance? And so therefore, this fine-tuning the universe is best explained due to design, and that the designer is whom we would call God. Thirdly, the third argument would be the signature in the cell argument confirms the existence of God. So the argument is as follows. First premise: DNA contains specified complex information. Second premise: this is either caused by an intelligent cause or a material cause. Third premise: it cannot be a material cause because no material causes have been known or discovered to demonstrate the power to produce specified complex information. And four, therefore, the best explanation of the specified information in DNA is that it was caused by an intelligent cause. So DNA is best explained by an intelligent cause rather than a material cause. Because we know that there's 2 types of causes in this world. First is a material cause, and second is an intelligent cause. William Dembski makes a good analogy of this. He says that when we look at the Grand Canyon, we can easily say that this was done by a material cause because water has been known to cause erosion, to cut away the sediments, and so forth. But however, when we look at Mount Rushmore, we know that nature has not produced this. Rather, it is an intelligent mind that has created this because it has meaning and it represents specific people, which are president's faces. And so in the same way, the question we have in our minds is this: where did this information in the DNA come from? The DNA has a four-letter chemical alphabet known as adenine, thymine, cytosine, cytosine, and guanine, otherwise known as A, T, C, and G. The DNA builds protein, and even to build one protein, you will need at least 1,200 to 2,000 letters. And these letters must be precisely all in the right sequence and all in the right order in order to build amino acids so that the amino acids can come together to build a protein molecule. And in order for a protein to function, it requires something called a tertiary structure. And in order to have this tertiary structure to make a protein function, you will need at least 75 amino acids. And for this to happen by chance, for all the 75 amino acids and only finding the right-handed amino acids to bond together in the right sequencing and timing, to make that happen by chance is this. And according to PhD Stephen Myers, he says it'll be one chance in 100,000 times trillion 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 times trillion. And that's actually 10 with 125 zeros after it. And that are the chances of that happening by chance. And that's what it would take to get one protein molecule. And the complex cells needs 300 to 500 of these protein molecules. So what are the chances of that?
And that is time.
And so I've presented three good arguments with Kalam, cosmological argument, fine-tuning, and design. And I would like to say that science does confirm the existence of God. Thank you.
All right, so Daniel has just presented the first argument for does science affirm God? And he went through that by explaining the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the signature in the cell arguments. We are going to hear from Edwin Swomanen, and he's going to present his case.
I think it was telling that Daniel started his remarks by explaining just what's at stake. He mentioned eternity. And I know what it's like to have that staring in the face because I spent 40 years as a Christian. And evolution was the first thing that I noticed that was not quite jiving with my religious upbringing. And when you have that at stake, as Daniel mentioned, there is a huge amount of resistance to new information that would conflict with that viewpoint that you've been taught. So what that does is it shifts the burden of proof from where it should be, which is the topic of our talk. Does science confirm theism? And really what it does in the mind of the believer is it makes it the opposite. It says, is there anything about science I could possibly cite that would salvage my belief in theism? And that's really what's going on here. The intelligent design creationism is cafeteria creationism, and we've heard it a couple times here cited, the familiar talking points from these intelligent designers. And it is a form of creationism. It's as one of the, I can't pronounce his name, he's a Russian guy, but he says that intelligent design is actually creationism dressed up in a cheap suit. It really is, because it refers back to this idea of this unnamed designer. We all know who this designer is. We all know what is really being referred to. It didn't fool Judge Jones in the Kitzmiller case, and it shouldn't fool anybody. We know who the designer is referred to. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Bible. In fact, Daniel referred to that when he said Genesis and ex nihilo creation. Of course, the Genesis account is contradictory with itself, much less with any idea of science. But I don't think we're going to belabor the point on that. I wanted to start with really the last point that he made about this. There were a lot of zeros, 10 to the 10 to the 10, repeated numerous times about how unlikely it is that we would have DNA. And that's true. And I was thinking on my way over here tonight that this would probably come up. And my walk over here was incredibly unlikely. For me to make it from my house down on 4th Street in Oakland and wind up here, the odds, think of the odds. I could have wound up at the pub I could have wound up out on the lawn or at somebody's house or Monty's house down the street. I could have wound up in any number of places, but here I am. Here I am sitting here at this table. The odds are just incredible. Well, of course we know that that's not how it happened. What happened was I had this goal of showing up here. Now, you might think goal-directed design. Hear me out here. When I made my way from my house, I made certain decisions, and I turned right, and then I walked. As I made my way down the road, whole options disappeared. They were no longer even options. For me to turn around and go back home, there's not even an option that I considered. As I got closer, making my way to this building and that building was the whole universe of choices for me to make my way into this room. And this is what happens with evolution, that the whole universe of these other options disappears. We have fossil genes in our DNA that no longer can encode for certain things. They used to, but those options disappeared millions of years ago, thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago. Lactose intolerance, genes for different things. They're no longer there. My egg yolk genes in my DNA don't do anything anymore. I couldn't produce egg yolk if I wanted to. Those options have disappeared. And so what happens is the whole universe of choices disappears. But really the way to look at it is backwards. It's a little bit counterintuitive when you look at evolution because it's a bottoms-up process. It's a process where you're looking back in time at what happened to those narrow choices. So I'd like to do that. I could talk about, before I do that, I want to acknowledge the strongest of the points. Second law of thermodynamics, the sun shined today, okay? We don't need to talk about that, do we really? The sun shone today, energy entered the system, end of subject, all right? Let's talk about, I'll grant you the strongest of your points. The strongest of your points, I think, is the fine-tuning argument. It's a real issue that there are all these constants and that the correct, miraculous, if you want to call it, combination. What I would come back with that on is just to say that, okay, the Almighty God is constrained in what he can do. So we've now put constraints on God that he had to generate the universe in this certain way. You can look at that in both ways and say, well, we have all these constants. We have a very limited scope of possibilities. You can start to say, well, wait a minute, we're limiting God in what he could do. So I'll grant you it's the strongest of the arguments, but there are issues with that. But now, leaving that aside, I want to go to the evolution issue here, because to me that is a fascinating issue it's such a powerful explanatory framework. So here we are, and our parents had certain traits. We have 50 mutations approximately in each of our DNA that our parents didn't have. No combination of their chromosomes could have resulted in us. All 3 billion characters were exactly the same if you put the chromosomes together in whatever combination, except there's about 50 mutations. And their parents had about the same 50 mutations, and so on. And you go back 10,000 generations is yesterday in terms of human evolution. That's when we actually had evidence of Homo sapiens, in the modern form, anatomically modern humans. A lot can happen in those 10,000 generations. A lot has happened. We just don't see it. And one of the things that frustrates me about creationists, including the intelligent design variety, is they try to resort to saying, wow, we don't see these changes. Well, it's like sitting on a lawn in the summertime and saying the grass isn't growing because you haven't seen anything happen. We have a very limited framework as human beings. We only see at most a couple generations. Oh, I got my mom's big nose, but I got my dad's bald head. Okay, you can see that. And I can look at my grandparents and I can say, I can kind of see the resemblance. But we really can't see that far back. But when you look at the evidence, and I could not possibly do justice to it sitting here in the next 3 minutes that I've got, it is amazing. And I really just want to make a plea to you guys to actually look and take out this business about eternity and the fear of that, and actually look at the amazing evidence that we have for evolution, and then stop and think about, Daniel's statement here, there's no good reason to believe science disproves God. Really? I mean, when you look at the evidence for evolution, and you look at the vestigial DNA, the egg yolk DNA was one of the things. The hair that I've got here, the goosebumps that I get if I get excited or cold, so I fluff up the fur that I no longer have. All the different things, the recurrent laryngeal nerve that I have that comes down from my brain, it goes down and it loops around the aortic arch in my heart, and then it goes back up to my vocal cords. So I'm talking right now, and it's making this detour. An intelligent designer made this thing go down like that, and it gets really ridiculous in the case of the giraffe, where it goes down a good 15 feet for a detour, okay? There's a great reason why that happened, and that is because evolution cannot plug holes. It cannot cut wires. Those are drastic changes. Evolution makes little, tiny changes of one generation at a time. An intelligent designer does not do those kind of things. So I got 20 minutes, I got 30 seconds left, but I just want to say, look at the evidence and try to back off of a lot at stake. I have to defend this position come hell or high water. I know what it's like to be there. I know what the sinking feeling is like to say, this makes a whole lot more sense than what I've been taught, but I can't believe it because this could happen to me. Take a look at the evidence and then stop and think, is the burden of proof really being met? And where are you putting the burden of proof?
Thank you, Edwin. All right, so we just finished the first round of presenting the cases in which Edwin took points of Daniel's argument and analyzed them and presented. He exhorted you to look at the evidence for evolution. Daniel, you will have 5 minutes as far as rebuttal, and then Edwin, you will have another 5 minutes of rebuttaling Daniel's rebuttal. So, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Yes, I'm ready. All right. Well, Edward, he did say some things about the intelligent design movement. He did say that it is religious propaganda and so forth. And what I would say about that is, or it's another form of creationism. But I know there's a lot of intelligent design movements, people that say that it is not creationism, but actually I think it is also a form of creationism because most of them are brought by Christians. So I'll be the first to admit that. But just because it has a religious propaganda, I don't think that refutes the argument. Because if anything else, I could have had an atheistic propaganda with other theories, but that doesn't refute that argument. And so even if, for example, if Einstein had a religious motivation to somehow, not necessarily religious, but if his motivation was to support the Nazis and he brought up the theory of general relativity, that just because he had that motivation or to bring upon a propaganda, if you could even call it a propaganda, then it doesn't refute that his theory of general relativity where E equals mc squared. And so what I'm saying is even if it is a religious propaganda, it doesn't refute the argument, I think, of whether the evidence that we see here is intelligent design. And also, Edwin talked about the probability of DNA, and I did hear this before, and he is right on the fact that just because something is improbable, it doesn't mean that it is designed. Because, like what he said, he could have just walked in here, with all chances he would have been somewhere else. And so I'll grant him that it's true, that improbability does not mean it is designed. But the thing that I am seeing here is not just improbability, but what we would call specified. And William Dembski, he has a method of design detection where he says, if something is specified and complex, so it's improbable, but at the same time it's also is specified, then we can see that this is design. And so when we look at the information, we have to really look at this really carefully because all what science is about is finding explanations. They're out to look for better explanations. And and the best side that Edwin has is actually chance. And when we look at information inside the DNA, we can see that this is actually from design. There's intelligence behind these letters here, because we know that invariably intelligent agents have the causal adequacy to make specified complex information. And when we look at the material causes, there's not one single material cause that is known in science that are able to even cause specified complex information. But we know through experience that intelligent agents are known to produce specified complex information, and they're causally adequate. And therefore, it seems to me that it is a much more better explanation of the information in the DNA rather than chance or any other means. And so my main question is, where did this information come from? I mean, did it really come from chance, or is it from an intelligent mind? And it's when we look at specified complex information anywhere, we know invariably that it comes from intelligence, not chance. Also, when it comes to the fine-tuning argument, he did touch on that, and I really appreciate Edwin's honesty in this, and he's obviously a very genuine man, and so and he did say it is one of the strongest, and given in the Christian apologetic world right now, it is one of the strongest arguments to have all these physical constants and also just the incredible razor-sharp, just the way how this universe is tweaked for life to exist. And the best that he had with that was that there's constraints on God with that. But whether there is really constraints on God or not, even if it is, it still says that God, it would still say that God still designed it, even if he did have a constraint or not. And so I thought I would like to hear a better argument for this, to refute this, because I've heard a lot of other theories, multiverse theories. I've heard chaotic inflation theories. I've also heard the weak anthropic principles and other illustrations or other arguments, or so forth, or there's a multi-universe machine or something like that. So I would like to at least hear a stronger argument against the fine-tuning other than just there's constraints on God, because that still shows that God has designed it or put his hand onto it. Also, for the cosmological argument, he didn't really talk anything about the cosmological argument. So far, I've shown that the DNA is better explained. The information is better explained through intelligent design rather than chance, and also fine-tuning is better explained through design. And also my cosmological argument is still untouched, it's left alone, and that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore this universe has a cause.
Thank you,
that
Daniel.
cause is God.
I didn't address Kalam argument because I think it's specious. I think it's just philosophical dodge, and the key word there is if, or begins to exist. Okay, there's a letter to the editor I read in 1910 where the guy says, for those that claim that the universe clearly had to have a beginner, an author, I would ask where this author came from. My question is just as valid as theirs. Now, Craig gets around that by using this word begins to exist, as if that somehow exempts God from scrutiny. But again, really, it's just a dodge. If the universe cannot have been, and I don't understand Lawrence Krauss's arguments about the multiverse. I've heard them, and I'm trying to understand them, about the quantum fluctuations and so on. It's pretty deep stuff. He posits how these things can come out of nothing. And to me, that almost sounds a little bit like a dodge, but I understand there's science behind it. So, but that's where I'm on Kalam. The thing that really I think is egregious that I want to get to is this specified complexity of Dembski's. And you say there's not one instance of where this information can come from. This is where we get back to this bottoms-up thing. And let me continue my journey back into the ancestors here. When we go back these generations, we are here because we had ancestors who had what it took to produce offspring that would be here. It's as simple as that. There's two words that really are the key to this whole thing, and that's differential replication. Okay. I think we could all agree that mutations happen. I just explained about the 50 mutations. These are facts that we have these 50 mutations. They've done studies on parents versus offspring, sequencing the whole DNA. Sure enough, that's where the number comes from. When you have a mutating replicator, evolution is inevitable. It cannot not happen. If you have a replicator that replicates with error, and you have a situation where the ones that thrive to the point where they can replicate, you will have mutation. You will have evolution. Because the ones that do not replicate aren't here anymore. And the ones that are here are the ones that replicate some more. And then they have mutations. And the ones that replicate some more have this certain pattern that continue and continue. And whatever the fitness landscape is, whatever the traits are that make them do better, are the ones that will have offspring that will generate those traits. And those traits have resulted in this odd mammal that we are, that have, you think about it, our hands with the 5 digits and our grasping reflex when we're babies and so on. All these things that we have, we take them for granted. And we think, well, this is complexity, this is information. This is survival traits or genetic drift for no reason at all. Genetic drift happens even without selection pressure, but it happens to get enshrined in the DNA, and then because it takes over for no good reason, just like Republicans or Democrats and certain political parties, they take over for no good reason, but then those things wind up dominating, and that gets enshrined in the DNA of the culture. Okay? This is where the information appears to come from, when it's really just this drift or selection that happens over thousands and thousands of generations. And it looks like information, and yes, in a way it is, but it's the filtering of selection or drift that's been applied to the noise of mutations. And this has happened for 3 billion years now. Okay? Evolution has been going on for at least 3 billion years. We have microfossils that are that old, 3 billion years. Think about it. This has been going on for a long time, more than any of our brains can really appreciate. And a lot happens at very gradual paces in that long time. It's not information being injected from above. It's filtering of noise through this torturous route of selection and drift.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I have a couple of questions for both of the debaters. I'm going to begin with Daniel because he presented first. When you presented your first argument, let me look at my notes just to make sure I'm following right. The cosmological argument, and you present the causal argument. So if something begins to exist, therefore it has a cause. Not to beg the question of who created God, how would you answer the question? And this is, I'll just go into it. What would be what would be the meaning of God? Not the meaning of God. I apologize. It was more articulated in my brain than what's coming out right now. If something is created, therefore it has a cause. What would be the cause of God, if therefore?
Well, at least for theists, at least with the argument, it does say whatever begins to exist has a cause, and we know that with God never began to exist, so he's not part of that premise there, unless I say that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but not everything, or just everything has a cause, but what I'm saying is everything that begins to exist, and the theist believes that God, he never began to exist, he's eternal, and because he's also outside of time, he's spaceless, and he's timeless, and he's eternal, he's a necessary being, and so he doesn't need to be caused by anyone, he was there as an eternal being. So, but by no way does that nullify the first premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause.
To that, I would just respond with the Saturday Night Live church lady. How convenient!
So, asking you a question. You mentioned evolution a lot. You talked about the 50 different differentiations between genetics and that argument that you proposed. I think one of the bigger issues that's happening behind the scenes would be micro and macro evolution, with micro being the subtleties, macro being
Artificial distinction. It doesn't actually exist. It's like you don't have, when you go on Google Maps or Google Earth to look at something, there's no boundary that says, oops, you're now into macro Google Earth. You were just in micro Google Earth, but now you're in macro. There's no such thing. There is just evolution. There's just, but what we try to categorize this, and of course it's very convenient for creationists to say, oh, well, of course there are these tiny little evolutions that's going on. But somewhere at some unspecified point, big chunks of change happened. Of course, Cambrian evolution is one of the places, the Cambrian explosion is one of the places where they try to say that, just because that's where the fossil record happened to memorialize a whole bunch of changes in a very, only in, what was it, only 100 million years or something. It was a fairly short span of time geologically. There's no distinction between macro and micro. It's not used by scientists as far as I know. It's only used by creationists.
So then the question would be proposed, in your own words, what would define evolution?
Evolution is the change in LL frequencies due to drift or selection pressure over time, and that's all it is. Or to put it in more simple terms, it's differential reproduction under selection pressure or just drift. But in either case, either one of those two things, whether it's sexual selection or natural selection, in other words, people start to look at traits, mostly choosy females are the ones that have done it over biology, just simply because they have the most to lose in investing in a worthless offspring, because they've spent 9 months or 10 months or whatever the gestation period is, and they made a bad bet. Well, they have a lot to lose, so it's the females that tend to pay attention to the feathers or whatever the trait is, and they tend to select for the males, and that produces some really amusing behaviors, like the bowerbird, which creates huts for its female to come into. It has nothing to do with any kind of real way that a bowerbird should actually reproduce. But anyhow,
Thank you.
If I could put in my,
Yes,
if I could, no,
Daniel.
if I could also just
Yeah,
ask for a
yes,
second.
please.
Yeah, I think that's really yeah. So I was wondering, because when it comes to evolution, I do know of Christians that even believe in, they would say theistic evolution, where they say that, and I know you're really familiar with that, how they say, and I know there's a lot of prominent figures I have a lot of respect for that. They say, actually, God, he guided the evolution to actually happen, and so God could have used, he could have used evolution as a means to bring about his creation, and I have a lot of respect for that, and I know it has some prominence right now with a lot of scientists, and so I don't really have too much problems with the evolution, because
well, you're raising all these points though that are talking points against it. You may not, but the sources that you're regurgitating this stuff from about specified complexity and second law and signature in the cell, Meyer's book, all that stuff. Those are people that make their living out of trying to discredit.
But I was wondering if you had a better explanation of, or if you knew of any material causes that could even create life in the first place, because even with evolution, just regardless of evolution, I think the problem is the origin of life, of how everything originated. And I know that you have talked about how they kept on reproducing, and maybe that could have produced offsprings, but then we look at science and it says that in the DNA, in order to even replicate a cell, you need information in the DNA. And so the information that it started gathering, it had to be there in order to even replicate, like for a cell to replicate. So I'm wondering, like when it comes to complex specific information, if you knew any material causes that could bring upon such complex information.
There's three main theories. We have a chapter in the book called "Who's on First?" It is one of the hard problems in biology is how did the first replicator show up? It's kind of like the biological version of fine tuning here. There had to have been enough there. And you think about it again. This is not really a debate topic, but when you think about it, the DNA has to have instructions for not only the body but also more DNA. it has to specify itself. So yeah, it's an amazing setup.
Mm-hmm.
There's Cairn Smith was the name of the guy who proposed this clay scaffolding theory, where it's kind of funny. It's almost like confirming what the Bible says, if you want to go with that, where I was formed from the clay, but that's a false cognate. It's just, but it's the clay that was non-biological, and then you had some biological precursors that showed up on that scaffolding. And then when they could finally form a structure, the clay didn't need it anymore. Another one is the lipid vesicles idea, where we know about bubbles, and when they split, you've seen big bubbles split into smaller ones, where actually these lipids would have some structure to them, and they would start splitting, and then the ones that actually split the best, and off we go to the races. And these are speculative ideas, although they are ideas. They are grounded in the natural. They're not grounded in how God must have done it. They're grounded in, okay, we walked right past that whole idea of the supernatural. Now let's figure out what is a natural way it could have happened. And the interesting thing about that is every time that's been done, the natural approach is what has succeeded. There has not been a single time ever that the supernatural approach has yielded the answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, because when we look at the information that we see in DNA, I mean, in order to even replicate itself, it needs an incredible amount of information, as long as encyclopedia. And for all of this to, for any of this to happen, it just seems like, somebody outside must have designed this, and it just seems any kind of, even though you might not, I hope that you don't think that I'm using the God of the gaps kind of reasoning here, because I do admit that there's some people or believers that say, you know what, I don't know how this began to be, therefore God just must have done it by default. And I do agree that is a science stopper, because it stops scientists from actually doing more research on explaining phenomena and how things happen. Just because we don't know how it happened, we can't just say God did it. I totally agree. I'm in agreement with just the people that would say that. But this is not just saying, we don't know why God just did it, but we're just looking at the principle of uniformitarianism, which says that the causes that we see today are probably the causes that we see in the past. And the causes that we see of any kind of specified complex information, the causes of that is an intelligent agent anywhere.
Well, specified complexity is a made-up term that is in service of the Discovery Institute and the intelligent design movement. Specified complexity is not a real issue. I've just gotten done explaining, and I know it takes a while. It took a while for me to sink into me this bottoms-up approach, where we're looking at the end result and trying to say, well, how did we get here? Well, actually, the real question is, what is different from me to my immediate ancestors, and then their ancestors, and their ancestors, and so on? And we are here because we had ancestors who had ancestors, and so on. The specified complexity is just a talking point. Now, the real issue, we've got this tiny issue here of the first replicator. That's a real issue. I don't mean to minimize it. It's a real issue. What I mean by tiny is that this is the first step, physically tiny. Somewhere with this small interval of only 100 million years, maybe, when the conditions were right on the early Earth to produce the first replicator, there was only this 100 million years for this thing to finally start replicating, okay? From a non-biological origin. That is a big step. I'll acknowledge that. And we don't know, and we can't know what that was.
Actually, I think we can know.
Well, you say God, of course. Okay.
Well, yeah, I would say God, and that's only because, I think we can know, actually, because we have, from our information, from the experience that we have today, and knowing from our experiences, it's not from ignorance, but looking at the evidence today, we know that it's only intelligent agents that can give that information in that cell in order to replicate itself.
Well,
All right, and I'm going to end the conversation piece. Thank you guys for both sharing and being humble in your approach to one another. And Now I'm going to open the floor up to any of the members of the audience who have any questions for the debaters.
Sure, why not? Well, Daniel, I just was thinking about the prime mover and infinite regress. When you say that something needs a cause, then the cause needs a cause, and the cause of the cause also needs a cause. That really doesn't tell me anything. All that tells me is that when you say there must be one uncaused cause, that just seems like an excuse for saying something other than I don't know.
Well, so your question was, sorry, this.
How do you get from infinite regress to an uncaused cause?
Well, yeah, I think we would agree that infinite regress is a contradiction. It is an impossibility, and so which means that there must have been a cause in the beginning. There must have been a first cause, and that first cause, he was spaceless and he's also timeless because he must be outside of time and space in order to even create space in the first place. And so because it is impossible for there be an infinite regress of causes, there must have been a first cause, and he is also, we would say, as a necessary being, which means he's eternal, and so that he could cause temporal things to come into being. So if infinite regress is really impossibility, then there must be a real first cause, and that's what
Or that the universe has
Thank you.
always existed.
We're going to move on to the next
All right.
question.
I've got 2 points for Daniel. I'll save the other ones for later.
I think he should have the right to respond to the questions to me, and I should be able to respond to the questions to him. So as far as the infinite regress, there was no answer to the question there. There was no answer. It's just simply special pleading to say that I posit this entity that has all these convenient characteristics to support my theology. And the most important one is that he didn't have to have a cause. He's there already. So we can base everything on that. That's vacuous. That's just exempting your deity from the requirements that you place on the universe itself.
Thank you.
All right. So the point I was wanting to make before you're setting the odds of any particular universe from coming out exactly the way it was, with gambling, there's a very similar issue. Is if you're buying a lottery ticket saying, what are the odds that I'm going to win? The odds are going to be like 250 million to 1. The odds, you basically say it's not going to happen. But for some reason, every time you play the lottery, somebody does win. There's a 250 million chance and somebody always wins. And so those odds are presuming that we are the only choice. Like there's if there are odds, one of those odds is going to win regardless of how unlikely it is. And so whether it's us or not us, it's just as improbable, but it's still going to happen. And sort of an extension of that is if we're presuming an infinite, since God would have to be infinite in his own ways, if you're existing in an infinite realm, invariably something incredibly impossible will happen, and it will, like for instance, if all of the things will collapse, then the one that expands is going to expand and continue to grow. It's the only one that will do so because it's the only one that can, whether someone's directing it or not. Sorry, I'm long day of testing and classes, so I'm a little distracted with that. And well, I'll get to the one that actually matters that you can respond to. So when we look at the trees, we look at the Grand Canyon, we say this is what nature does, and when we look at car, it's made to go, you push the button, it goes, and that's what man made. What really frustrates me is when people then say, all right, let's look at this tree. Clearly it's been designed because of all these complex things in it, but that doesn't really work because you just said this is what our control for nature is. So how do you apply? What is your standard for nature when you're now calling nature man-made?
Yeah, well, I don't know. When it comes to like nature, when it comes to things like when it comes to trees and plants and things like that, I mean that is definitely a little different, and I have to admit the argument is weaker. I don't know if they could really say that, look at the trees and the sun, and can't you say that you can't just, they'll say that, obviously it's God, but, I just think that, I understand their intentions, but it's not really good arguments, like what you said. And I think that it's really bad to look at that. I mean, if anything else, I think to look at design, just looking at the universe, the initial constants and the quantities of the electromagnetic field, or the electrons and the neutrons and the balancing between that, I think that's just much more better. Or when they look at just even like the DNA and so forth, I think those are much more stronger to say that that this is from design rather than any of those things. And going back to the first one, you know, you're right that it is probable, and people say that you cannot, because science is not about certainty. It is probable that this has come by probability and chance. So we can't say that, we can't just move that out of the explanation. It is probable that this did happen by chance, which is true, like the lottery example. But I think a better metaphor is actually this. For example, let's say we go to Mars, and there's Robin Collins uses this illustration. I think this is a better illustration. You go to Mars, and first we see that there's nothing there, and so we go back and we come back to Mars, and all of a sudden when there's nothing, we see that there's a biosphere, which is like a biosphere with glass, and inside there's actually, let's say there's 12 dial settings, and each of them has to be precisely there in order for life to exist in there. And later on we go there, we look at the dials, and every single one of those dials is precisely what it needs to be for life to sustain in there. The oxygen level, the gravity setting, the carbon cycle, and all sorts of these things. And all 12 of these are precisely made in such a way where one little tweaking would mean that there would be no life to exist inside that sphere. And so we come back and we look at that sphere, we're saying, hey, you know what? Who did this? And we would probably think, I don't know, maybe an alien. Maybe an alien might have done this, or something, but it couldn't have just randomly been precisely set like that. And so I think that might be a better illustration to say, you know what, it's more probable that somebody has rigged this universe rather than not. And so,
There's a problem here, though, and that is that it is another version of the infinite regress problem. Is that, okay, let's assume that this is true about the fine-tuning, and it is, all these different constants. But you're postulating a very, very precise fine-tuner who has the ability to set all these constants. So you still are winding up with this extremely implausible entity that is sitting there twiddling these knobs and making everything like that. So we still are faced with an equivalent to the infinite regress problem.
Thank you.